This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. For some time now, the RCMI has been very proudly involved with the Hill 70 Memorial Project. On October the 29th, Dr. John Scott Cowan, Principal Emeritus of Royal Military College in Kingston and Vice Chair and Director of Research of the Hill 70 Project, spoke to us over luncheon about the significance of the Hill 70 battle, both for Canada as an army and as a nation. Dr. Cowan.
So, without more ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Cowan.
Well, 27 days ago, as many of you in this room know, a completion ceremony was held at the Hill 70 Memorial, close to the site of the Battle of Hill 70 at Loos-en-Gohelle in France. It is the first major Canadian war memorial built on a foreign battlefield in the 81 years since the completion of the Vimy Memorial. Its construction, and indeed the entire Hill 70 Memorial project, has been carried out without a cent of Canadian government funding. Those of you gathered in this room are not entirely typical Canadians, because most of you have known something of Hill 70 for most of your adult lives. But most Canadians alive today had never heard of Hill 70 until fairly recently. The Canadian decision after the Great War to centralize Canadian commemoration of the 11,000 lost without a known grave by building the extraordinary and moving monument on the remains of Hill 145 at Vimy Ridge had as an unintended consequence the near disappearance from memory of another transformative event for Canada. As the Vice Chair and Director of Research of the Hill 70 Memorial Project, I'm as surprised as anyone that it succeeded. In my explanations of Curry Hall to visitors and students at RMC, I had been talking up the significance of Hill 70 for many years. But when the indomitable Mark Hutchings called a meeting of a half a dozen folks at his home in Kingston 8 years ago to try to launch a campaign to properly commemorate the Canadian achievements at Hill 70, my private thoughts were, these are good folk, I'm going to give them all the help I can, but this is never going to work. When recently I confessed to Mark that I had harbored these early doubts, he said, yeah, I thought the same. We were both wrong. When Canadians know what needs to be done, generally they just do it. When we told our story, support came. The Hill 70 Memorial Project aims to ensure a good understanding of the battle and its significance. The striking memorial in France is for commemoration, while the definitive history of the battle, Capturing Hill 70, from UBC Press, edited by Doug Delaney and Serge Derflinger, has become a bestseller. And packages of extraordinarily interesting teaching materials were sent to every Canadian high school. So I will not try to compete with Delaney and Derflinger at all by presenting a detailed battle history, but I will try to describe how Hill 70 was indeed transformative and dissect where it fits in the maelstrom of events of World War I. Now, the Great War compressed into under 52 months a massive wave of some of the most rapid political and technological change ever seen. And Canada rode the crest of that double wave, but Canadian culture came into play as well. Though most Canadians believe that the British North America Act created a country in 1867, it didn't. It only provided for internal self-government of the colony of Canada. In the 47 years from Confederation to 1914, no country had an embassy in Canada, nor did Canada have any representatives abroad, except for a High Commissioner in the UK from 1880 and an agent in France after 1882, both with very limited duties and limited access to information. If Canada wished to communicate with a nation-state, the Governor-General would write to the Colonial Office in London, who would forward the communication to the Foreign Office, who would in turn move the question to the British Embassy in the country of interest. On the 4th of August 1914, the day that Britain declared war on Germany, Sir George Purley was appointed acting High Commissioner from Canada to London. But Sir George was not allowed to see the correspondence between the Governor-General and the Colonial Office. At the outbreak of the war, Canada declared war on no one. Britain did it for all the Empire. Canada merely got to decide how it would react to being at war. The first commander of the Canadian Corps was Lieutenant General Edwin Alderson, a British officer appointed by Britain after consultation with Canada. He was reprimanded early in the war by the War Office in London for responding directly to questions from Ottawa. He was reminded that all communications with Canada were to be passed through the War Office. Thus, early in the war, Canada was seen merely as a source of manpower for the British Army. When the war broke out, Canada was a nation of perhaps 7.5 million people. Some 680,000 went into uniform, about 625,000 of them into Canadian uniform, and about 500,000 went to Europe. Some 66,000 died, and 172,000 were injured or fell gravely ill during operations. But in 1919, Canada had a seat at the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, a seat in the League of Nations, and the right to be elected to the League Council. Effectively, Canada was a nation-state, and somehow 4.5 years had done what 47 earlier years had not. Canada had acted like a nation, and so came out of the Great War as a nation. In Canada, students are taught variously that complete independence from Britain was achieved by the Statute of Westminster, 1931, or by the patriation of the Constitution, 1982, for effect in 1985. But no one is really so naive. Paperwork follows later to solemnize facts on the ground. Paperwork doesn't lead events, it follows them. Canada's War of Independence was the First World War, the so-called Great War. Unlike the Americans, our War of Independence was not fought against the entity from which we became independent, but alongside it. We started the war as a colony, and we ended it as an ally. The autonomy came gradually. Political efforts by Borden and his ministers were important, but the real lever for that autonomy came from the performance of the Canadian Corps and its first Canadian commander. Now, we all learn about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, 9 to 12 April 1917, the first action in which all 4 divisions of the Corps fought together. At the time, the Corps was commanded by Lieutenant General Julian Byng, a British general who in June was promoted to command the British Third Army. In the 1920s, he was Governor General of Canada. His senior division commander, Major General Arthur Currie, had considerable input into the planning for Vimy, informed by his study of the French defense of Verdun. Because of meticulous planning and rehearsing, recent technological advances, and good leadership, the Canadian Corps succeeded where in 1915 French troops had twice failed and suffered about 150,000 casualties. During a period with little other good news, the Canadian Corps victory at Vimy got tremendous attention, and it has since rightly taken on iconic significance for Canadians. It changed Canadian attitudes profoundly and set the stage for what was to come. But it was not uniquely Canadian, nor under Canadian control. Of the 170,000 men involved in the Allied attack on Vimy Ridge that day, only about 97,000 were Canadian. In some ways, it was not a Canadian battle, but a British battle with high Canadian content and some Canadian planning. But exactly 2 months after the start of the assault on Vimy Ridge, a Canadian, Sir Arthur Currie, was promoted Lieutenant General and given command of the Canadian Corps. On the 7th of July, when Currie had been Corps Commander for 28 days, he received orders from General Henry Horne, commander of the British First Army, of which the Canadian Corps was a part, to attack the small industrial city of Lens, somewhat north of Vimy. Currie objected. In the ensuing exchanges, Field Marshal Haig and General Byng both agreed with Currie's reasoning and counseled a rethink. Why had Currie balked? For good reason. Canadian generals were more inclined than British generals to do their own recce. Perhaps that was a residuum of the class system. Indeed, the casualty rates for Canadian general officers in the Canadian Corps were higher than for the Corps as a whole, 42%, vice 37%, partly as a result of taking those risks. Currie had done his own recce of Lens and considered it a killing ground, as it was an open book to the German artillery observers on the hill to the northwest. From that hill, the German gunners could see the entire Douai Plain, the flat coal mining area east of Vimy Ridge. Currie made it clear that he would prefer to attack and capture the high ground first. Currie's view prevailed. 3 days later, on July 10, after a meeting of commanders at his headquarters, Horne issued revised orders to the First Army. It begins, and I'm quoting, "As a result of discussion with the GOC Canadian Corps and of the allotment of additional artillery to the First Army, the Army Commander has decided to amend the objectives laid down for the Canadian Corps." The orders moved Currie a bit further north along the front and essentially turned that section of the front over to Currie. Para 3 reads in part, "The adjustments detailed above will place the whole of the operations for the capture of Lens in the hands of the GOC Canadian Corps, and his immediate main objective will be the capture of the high ground northwest of the town." It is the first mention in Army level orders of the need to capture the high ground which subsequently became known as Hill 70. It is here that I must mention my only substantial disagreement with any of the chapters in capturing Hill 70. And that is with the speculation in Nicholas Gardner's chapter that the suggestion for the capture of Hill 70 before attacking Lens came from staff officers on Henry Horne's staff. Professor Gardner is British, and that has been the standard British assumption. But 3 lines of evidence suggest somewhat otherwise. First, various diaries, including Currie's, suggest it was Currie's strongly held view. Secondly, there is evidence in Horne's own orders of the row which almost certainly took place between July 7 and July 10. The first words in the new order on the 10th were, if you recall, as a result of discussion with the GOC Canadian Corps. Now, I've pursued lots of Army level orders from the Great War, and I have not seen others which begin with such a personalized sort of phrase. So I'm pretty convinced that it's almost certainly formal British understatement, or Brit speak, if you will, for you can't imagine how irked the GOC Canadian Corps was with the previous version of this, but this should calm him down. Thirdly, Currie had balked before, to good effect. On June 2nd and 3rd, 1916, the 3rd Canadian Division had been partly overrun between Mont Sorel and Sanctuary Wood, and its CO, Major General Malcolm Mercer, was killed, and Brigadier General Williams was injured and captured by the Germans. The sector was in some disarray. 1st Canadian Division, to the right of the 3rd, was ordered to recover the lost ground immediately. The commander of 1st Canadian Division was Major General Arthur Currie, and he emphatically declined to proceed immediately, insisting on additional time to make appropriate preparations. He grudgingly got the time and proceeded to regain the lost ground, capturing many German prisoners. So the standard folk wisdom had become, If Currie balks, he may have good reasons, he's got good instincts. Between 15 and 20 August 1917, 3 divisions of the Canadian Corps, plus 1 in reserve, battled 5 German divisions and took and held Hill 70. The attack cost the Corps some 3,500 casualties and the clever and innovative defense against days of large-scale counterattacks, which according to some sources constituted 21 distinct counterattacks, cost another nearly 2,300 casualties. But the Canadians held, and to this day, no one knows the German losses. But some German sources place them at above 20,000. 5 German divisions virtually ceased to exist as coherent formations, and 2 others were badly damaged. The action at Hill 70 and Lens had been intended to weaken the forces available to the Germans for 3rd Ypres, Passchendaele, and it clearly achieved that aim. I focused on the capture and holding of Hill 70 and not the subsequent only partially successful attempt to invest Lens. Generally, Canadians think of the 2 actions together, covering August 15 to 25, 1917, as both are addressed in Horne's order the 10th of July and are juxtaposed in Nicholson's official history. But the Lens phase was hastily planned and the plan never fully developed. As it happens, it was probably an unnecessary action, as the requisite damage to the German units which the British had hoped to interdict from reinforcing Passchendaele was achieved in the earlier Hill 70 phase. And the Germans remaining in Lens could never be secure or at ease with the Canadians holding Hill 70, being able to see and hit targets within Lens at will. It had been a hard fight. 6 Canadians received the Victoria Cross for their actions at Hill 70 versus 4 at Vimy Ridge. The successful battle for Hill 70 was a watershed. After that, Currie had new status. He was viewed as having superb judgment. Army commanders treated him very carefully. Henry Horne, 1st Army, Henry Rawlinson, 4th Army. I think there was a period where you had to be Henry to be a British Army commander. Suddenly, the Canadian Corps had become a national allied army and not just another unit of the British Army. It's also worth noting that the battle honor Hill 70, still carried by many units of the Canadian Army today, is the only Canadian battle honor from the Great War which is not also a British battle honor. Now, some confusion arises because 4 British units, 2 of which still exist, do have Hill 70 for a battle honor, but it's not the Battle of Hill 70, but for some smaller actions on the approaches to Hill 70 from April to July 1917. So not the same action. The Canadian Corps under Currie, at this point, was doing very well indeed and began to differentiate itself from a typical British Corps. It always had one advantage over a British Corps, and that was the lack of churning. A British Corps was an ephemeral sort of thing, with divisions being switched frequently from corps to corps. Reorganization, a new group of commanders to deal with, and a rapidly changing order of battle were constant. The Canadian Corps, thanks to Borden's and Currie's insistence, stayed together, and relationships and expectations stabilized. Later, the Corps carried some of its own reinforcements with it, and it had always had a consistent support organization. But the Canadian differentiation was driven as well by 3 other factors, which I'm tempted to ascribe to the slightly different nature of Canadian society and the unusual backgrounds of the leaders of the Canadian Corps. First, in the Canadian Corps, there was always a tendency to accord junior leaders more responsibility than might be expected, and hence to delegate further down the chain of command than others might. Secondly, the avoidance of unnecessary casualties assumed greater importance in the Canadian Corps than it seemed to amongst our allies of the day. And thirdly, the Canadians were avid adopters of new technologies, at a time when new gizmos and new techniques were appearing with great frequency. It is common to ascribe at least the first two of these differences that I cite to the fact that early 20th century Canada was dramatically less class-ridden than early 20th century Britain. And the Canadian existence still embodied a fair bit of can-do pioneering spirit and a stronger tendency to look out for one another in harsh settings. These are all true indeed, but something additional was also at work. The general officers of the Canadian Corps had, for the most part, not been lifelong full-time soldiers. The two near exceptions were the two RMC ex-cadets. Number 151, Sir Archibald Cameron MacDonald, except for two exchange periods with the Northwest Mounted Police, was consistently permanent force. He commanded 1st Canadian Division after the 9th of June 1917. And there was number 256, Sir Henry Burstall, a career gunner, who commanded the Corps Artillery and then took command of the 2nd Canadian Division from 1916 till the end of the war. All the rest had other civilian careers. This did two things. First, they knew they were not as completely steeped in military lore as their Reg Force British counterparts, and so they were very open to learning new stuff. Secondly, they brought quite a bit from their other careers. Of the general officers in Currie's Corps, 2 had been career journalists, 4 had been lawyers, one of them, Brigadier General Griesbach, had been mayor of Edmonton, and 2 were trained scientists and engineers. One of those, Andrew McNaughton, had been assistant professor of mechanical engineering at McGill, and the other, Charles Hamilton Mitchell, became Dean of Engineering at the University of Toronto immediately upon demobilization. A majority of the leaders of the Corps were gunners, and it's often said that the First World War for Canada was a gunner's war. But one must remember that in the late 19th century, the artillery were the intellectuals of the profession of arms, as they represented and used the high science of that era. In the years after the publication of Maxwell's equations, but before the rise of atomic science, many learned people felt that science was nearly complete, with just a bit of polishing left to do. And that macro world that it described was sort of the end of science. And the gunners used all that macro science. The dismal facts of 1914 forced rapid technological change. 1914 was worse than anything that you've ever seen portrayed on film. The tactics were little different from the mid-19th century. There was no fire and movement, no lateral trench clearing raids, but the machine gun existed. 1915 saw new tactics. 1916 saw new technologies, including the tank. Even the concept of using wire cutters in trench raids for stealth rather than using artillery to cut wire was an innovation coming from the 25th Battalion of the 5th Brigade in January 1916. By 1917, the set-piece attack had been nearly perfected. Improved barrel wear algorithms and better standardization of shells meant being on target without registration. Better fusing meant the artillery did often cut the wire. Scientific skills were brought to the design of the rolling barrage and the back barrage, including the first use of large numbers of machine guns in barrage work. Counter-battery fire was perfected with important Canadian advances in sound location of opposing batteries, using waveform matching with an arc of microphones. The Canadians knew of flash spotting as well, but used it less. In the Corps Counter-Battery Office, led by Andrew McNaughton, the projects were the beginning of what today we call operations research. At Vimy, 83% of the 212 heavy guns of the German batteries opposing the Canadian positions were put out of action early by extensive counter-battery fire buried in the rolling barrage. Other innovations were things like careful, repeated rehearsals for attacks using similar terrain. There were new systems of giving orders so everyone down to the rank of corporal understood their objective and those of the people or units around them. Traditionally, you see, orders grew in volume and detail as they descended the chain of command, stopping often at the battalion level because at that point, many of them had reached 250 pages. The new system meant tearing off stuff as well as adding, so that each unit got detail for its role, just the basics for the units on their left and right of arc, and just an overview for the rest. This meant the process could continue all the way down to senior NCMs. Hill 70 saw elements of all-arms battle. Wireless communication from aircraft-borne observers allowed the artillery to target German troops massing for counterattacks by hitting them in their assembly areas, hence the horrific German losses in the counterattack phase of Hill 70. At last, the artillery forward observer was not limited by the tallest tree he could climb, and the gunners now had eyes beyond the horizon. In the months that followed, Currie differentiated the Canadians even more. In January 1918, he refused triangulation of Canadian divisions and in doing so refused personal promotion to Army Commander. At the time, British divisions had moved to a structure which included 3 brigades, each with 3 somewhat under-strength infantry battalions of 600 or 700 men each, and hence 3 by 3, or triangulation as it was called. Currie believed that triangulation could cause pointless casualties and preferred to fight divisions at full strength. He kept the infantry in the Canadian divisions at 3 brigades, each with 4 battalions of infantry. These were overstrength battalions too, at about 1,100 men each, as each carried 100 of their own reserves with them. He kept the Canadians as a corps rather than as an army, eschewing the complexity of having 2 corps headquarters and an army headquarters. But the Canadian Corps was by then larger and more powerful than most British armies, and each of the 4 Canadian divisions was equivalent to at least 1.7 British divisions. In 1918, Haig started adding to the impact of the 156,000 strong Canadian Corps by placing additional British divisions under Currie's command as well. In the spring of 1918, when the Canadians had been held out of the line during the attempted German breakout, the Canadians began experimenting with the development of open warfare doctrine. While still based upon the building block of the set-piece battle, it envisaged rolling battles designed in steps, a series of set pieces, each separately planned, each separated by 4 to 6 hours, like a ponderously walking giant. By Amiens, it worked just that way, with the 3rd Division halting at noon on the 8th of August and the 4th driving straight through it in the next step. The guns by then moved up to 5 times a day without registration. At Amiens, Currie used many tanks as ammunition and water carriers, and the Canadian Independent Force, Brutinel's force, used the parallel road on the right hinge of the battle between the Canadians and the French to run their trucks armed with 6-inch Newton mortars and heavy machine guns. That had been Currie's addition to General Rawlinson's plan. In a new all-arms twist at Amiens, low-flying coordinated aircraft were used to make noise, to mask the noise of the tanks, delaying considerably the German realization that tanks were advancing upon them. By then, the Corps had become quite different. By 1918, a Canadian division had 1 automatic weapon for every 13 men versus 1 for every 61 men in a British division. A Canadian division had about 13,000 infantry and about 3,000 engineering troops versus about 5,400 infantry and 650 engineers for a British division. Currie disliked exhausting the infantry to terraform the battlefield, and the Canadian Corps had 100 more trucks than any British corps. Every Canadian division had 66 bridge building experts. There were the beginnings of a distinct Canadian way of war. Move fast, do the impossible, build 6 bridges in one night, 3 more the next day. At Canal du Nord, the Germans overreacted, estimating that they were facing 12 Canadian divisions, not 4, and moved all available reinforcements into that sector to oppose them. Frequently, during the weeks of the pursuit towards Cambrai and then towards Valenciennes and Mons, the Canadians would outrun units on their flank, would have to widen their front and slow down. In the last 96 days of the war, known as the 100 Days, the Canadian Corps engaged and defeated 47 German divisions, one more than the 46 divisions defeated by 650,000 Americans in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. But the Canadians took half the casualties of the Americans, using twice the number of artillery shells. Curry's slogan had been, "Pay the price of victory in shells, not men." They were inventing as they went. New Canadian doctrine on open warfare, issued early in the 100 Days, included employment of mobile corps troops, issued on the 19th of September, and the policy as to the command of artillery units during offensive operations, issued on 20th September. Sometimes the new ways succeeded almost too well. At Mount Hoy, the key defensive high ground on the south edge of Valenciennes, the enthusiasm of the Canadian gunners for seeking the perfect fire plan reached its zenith. The British 51st Division had twice failed to take Mount Hoy. The Canadians, with access to 3 sides of it, hit it with a huge barrage of 2,149 tons, and then assaulted with the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade against the defending force uphill against 3 times their number. They succeeded, and furthermore, they did so with 80 dead and 300 wounded, while the German losses, killed and wounded, were 10 times as great. So yes, it was to some degree for the Canadians a gunner's war, and the allure of the perfect fire plan was too seductive and dominated much of the Canadian thinking during the interwar period, distracting us from the lessons on open warfare that we had accidentally taught others, who remembered it better than we did. It didn't help that our official history of that conflict was issued only in 1962, too late to indeed provide lessons for the Second World War. It might have been helpful if Canadians had remembered more about their defeat of German tanks, including 5 captured, repurposed British Mark IV tanks, in the combined arms action at Iway on the 10th and 11th of October 1918. But in that case, it was the losers who made the most of the lessons learned. One of the losers had been Lieutenant Ernst Volkheim, commanding tank A7V 560, which was put out of action at Iway. And he subsequently wrote The Tank in Modern Warfare and various other volumes, and he is one of the fathers of Blitzkrieg. But Hill 70 had been a watershed point, both in Canadian autonomy and in Canadian military differentiation. The important decision taken during 7 to 10 July 1917 to focus Canadian effort on Hill 70 was crucial. The instrument of that Canadian differentiation was the resolve and insight of a former school teacher, insurance company manager, and real estate speculator called Arthur Curry, who questioned an order that was not in Canada's interest. But his bold choice to protect his men would have had little ongoing impact if his judgment hadn't been vindicated by the events of August 15th to 20th, when the Canadians under his command won the battle for Hill 70. The successes of the Canadian Corps, particularly those under Canadian command, beginning with Hill 70 and culminating with the Battle of Amiens and the subsequent 100 Days, achieved great recognition for Canada and greatly enhanced Borden's role at Versailles. So while at the end of the Great War, there was something of a Canadian way of war, did it persist? In some ways, the differentiation was ephemeral, in that Canadians were early adopters of techniques and technology that were starting to penetrate elsewhere as well, and which in due course were adopted by most armed forces in the developed world. But traces of those early differences remain today. For example, reflect on the responsibilities accorded to a given rank. When compared to our closest English-speaking allies, Canadian officers and senior NCMs today still usually have responsibilities roughly equivalent to those carried by folk 1/2 to 1 rank higher amongst those allies. And comparing to other NATO allies, especially the more recent members of NATO, the disparity is often greater than 1 rank. Others may talk about the strategic corporal, but we have them. How many in this room experience the buildup of a multinational headquarters in some multilateral undertaking where once the staff slots are known and ranked, commanders want to fish for as many Canadians as they can to fill them, because they know that if you get a Canadian lieutenant colonel into a lieutenant colonel slot, you've got pretty much the equivalent of a colonel from another ally. Or note the AWSE, the acting while so employed promotions when Canadians deploy into special duty areas, so our folk will be viewed as equal rank to the Allied officers doing similar jobs. Concomitantly, we have a flatter income distribution across the rank structure compared to other nations, and our NCMs have somewhat higher average ages than amongst our allies, but with lots more life experience. As principal RMC, I often noted the relatively high educational level amongst NCMs and consequently a lesser or sometimes negligible social gulf between the NCM Corps and the Officer Corps. I certainly witnessed lots of NCMs getting degrees, including graduate degrees, at convocations over that decade. This differentiation from other militaries has been a godsend for us now that technology has dramatically increased the power of relatively small forces. But it would not have been surprising to the leaders of the Canadian Corps from Hill 70 onwards. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if there are.
Yes, Dr. Cowan will answer any questions if you have any questions.
Yes.
Dr. Cowan,
Bill.
I wonder if you would speak to the reputation that the Canadian Corps achieved after Hill 70 for its ruthlessness, and whether if such ruthlessness actually existed. And I think I read in some documentation that German troops, aware that they would be treated in a ruthless manner, had in fact abandoned the battlefield. And if such a situation existed, did it come from below or did it come from above?
Well, I think that what you have to understand after Amiens was that Germany really was collapsing. And so any force which was considered kind of shock troops, which by then the Canadian Corps was considered, were hugely alarming to them. After Amiens, what you often saw when German forces were retreating and falling back, and some reserves were being sent forward, it's not widely known. There was, at the end, around the end of the war, a socialist revolution in Berlin, and a regime installed that did not last long, which was essentially Marxist. As the Germans were retreating during the 100 days, troops being sent up to replace them were often stoned by the retreating troops, who called them scabs because, you know, the discourse of the left had taken over. And so I'm not sure that what you're really seeing was a a real effect or essentially a societal collapse during that period. And yes, the Canadian Corps played tough, but that was their job. They were shock troops.
Thank you.
Right.
Dr. Cowan, I wonder if you could take a moment and give us a commercial, how any of us in this room, if they so desired, could assist in helping the Hill 70 Memorial?
You betcha.
Just bring your checkbook.
Yes. I think to answer that question properly, I have to tell you just a tiny bit about why I think the thing worked. I mean, a good deal of why it worked sitting right here, but because then that will make it clear the last leg that we have to travel. In my view, this project worked as a way of ensuring perpetual understanding of those events for 3 reasons. First of all, it was a compatible group, most of whom had worked together in the past. We weren't, stuck in the mires of Ottawa. We didn't have all kinds of formal meetings to attend, and we were very well led by a chap with inexhaustible energy. But we were really a compatible group, no prima donnas. The second thing, and I'm sorry to put it in these terms, is it worked because we did not involve your government. We would not have been able to stick to intended timescales. The complexities might have overwhelmed us had we brought in the government. And the third reason why it succeeded is we had a good story. There is a good story here. It's a great narrative, and people like the story. So where are we now? Well, the physical works, except for very, very minor tune-up here and there, are done. The book's done. The educational materials are done. But we're not done. First of all, the Crown has not yet offered to take the project on for its perpetual care. Interestingly enough, this project is being offered to the Crown with a dowry, because we're in the last stages of fundraising and we are still happy to raise money, but it is our expectation to come to the end of the last little bits of things to do with about $1 million dowry. I don't know that anyone's ever approached the Crown saying, we want you to take over maintaining this thing, and by the way, here's the money to do it for the next 50 years. And we're still having a little trouble getting their attention. So we do have a backup plan, by the way, and there are military-oriented charitable enterprises that will take over and will take the dowry if needs be. But the 2 ways in which we could really use help would be, 1, any influence that anyone can bring to bear on the government of the day to get a cabinet order so the bureaucrats won't be worried about taking on extra responsibility, because in Ottawa's climate today, the bureaucrats just worry about, taking the lead on any decision. And the second thing is, of course, money. We're still raising money, not with the view to building the works, but with the view to maintaining things. Is that the right answer, gents? I mean,
We can send you the address.
Any other questions?
Susan?
Dr. Cowan, could you reflect on the lessons learned from the longs phase of this battle and how they might have informed the commander in going forward after the Battle of Hill 70?
Yeah. The Longs phase, which was much less successful, reflected a huge weakness of the Canadian Corps at the time, which was the lack of staff-trained officers. And an awful lot of the staff officers working with the Corps had been borrowed from the Brits. By that point, we were training, partly through hard knocks, a lot of our own. But for example, the much vaunted Corps Counter Battery Office, it wasn't just MacNaughton who was there, but a young British major by the name of Alan Brooke, later Lord Alan Brooke. So in fact, even Curry himself felt that there just hadn't been enough real staff work on the second phase done when it launched. So I think that's an important lesson. I'm sure there are other lessons, but it's been a while since I've read Nicholson on it, so I can't answer further.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.